welcoming in Walter to talk about Radix lessons learned from uh, DARPA. And again, if there are questions, comments to drop into the chat, uh, please do so. And as time permits, we will get to those. But a warm welcome and to Walter. And I'm going to turn the everything over to you if you are ready.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much for inviting me to this. Please do interrupt if there are any questions during this presentation. We're excited to present, and we were asked to look at some of the lessons we learned over the past 4 years as the Radix program winds down, and would love to participate in that discussion.
Excellent. No, and certainly as this is the third now, Hack the Capital, and y'all have been kind enough to share different stuff. What is some of the evolution? Then I'll just let you run with it of kind of what's different or kind of how has it grown up as it proceeds to leave the, I say, wind down.
Sure. So Radix started as a program looking at the power grid in a simulation. And what we realized is that simulations and models can only go so far to understanding the true cyber risk to the power grid. As we decided to move away from those simulations and models, we started to build up a very large real-world environment where people could interface with real grid hardware and look at not just localized attacks, but widespread attacks against an entire grid, try to understand how to bring that grid back. So what I'd say over the past 4 years is we've gone from something that just sits in one computer to something that spans an entire island.
And once again, I promise I can learn how to use a mic. No. But, and you've got a great presentation lined up if you want to scroll through as well.
Absolutely. So a little bit of background on DARPA. As an agency, we look at preventing strategic surprise. We have 6 technical offices. We're always trying to hire new program managers like myself for fixed terms positions where you can come in, pitch your idea. It's our own little venture capital sort of system. Get your account and get started. This program, Radix, started 4 years ago and it ends this fall. And what we've tried to look at within Radix is the risk to the power grid and how that could affect the Defense Department. We do this very closely with DOE. When we first started this program, we highlighted this issue that ICS vulnerability disclosures are going up. People have paid attention to these, and this community here especially is cognizant of this risk, but not a lot of the public and not a lot of the DoD policymakers really understood how this could affect the Defense Department. A lot of times when people talk about cyber risk to the power grid, it's hypothetical. It's how does that affect this one device? You know, how do I find this one vulnerability? What we're scared of is if our country did go to war, what a foreign power would try to do against the U.S. to prevent that. One of the lesser known things is that the U.S. Defense Department is the #1 consumer of the civilian power grid, and specifically we want to make sure it's protected so that we can continue to project force even during early times of hostility or conflict. From the Radix perspective, what we look at is the worst case scenario. We look at the worst case scenario not because we think that an adversary would take out the entire U.S. power grid, but we don't want to say we can only do something if this one thing is up or this is the thing we depend on for sure. So what we try to frame our program around is how would we still be resilient and how would we still restore the power grid in an absolute worst case scenario. So to go through a few terms of art that a lot of you here may already be familiar with, the normal way to restore the grid is to have a stable, healthy grid next to you energize a circuit, and try to get your substation up and running off that section of the grid. The worst case scenario is when the whole grid's down, you have to black start the power grid from the inside out. So you look at whatever generation you have left. Nick talked a little bit about coal plants. Coal plants require 10% of the power they generate to start. So power needs power to start, and you need to start with what you have left to begin this process of building a stable grid with stable voltage, stable frequency, try to get as many substations up as possible. And your priorities are going to be additional power generation assets, hospitals, we don't want people to die, but also these critical national security missions. We're looking at making sure that as quickly as possible come back online. So what we challenged our teams to do is look at, within a 7-day period, how do you start to look at all of these little computers sprinkled all over the power grid in every substation and try to restore them, try to find the infection, try to bring them back online so that they can be used for the safe running of our country's power grid. When all the power is out, things are difficult. ISPs go down. You can't rely on the traditional communications you had. Everything requires power to run. Transportation does. Really, starting from nothing becomes an incredible challenge. And again, not because we think that's what's going to happen, but if you can make it work even under these most dire circumstances, that means that it'll work. Your plan will work all the time. So what we've built in your first question of what's changed is this one-line diagram we're pretty proud of. So when you look at what a power company looks at from a architecture perspective, how many substations they have, where their generation is, where their critical loads are, you see a much, much bigger picture. But when you ask that same power company, let's say your neighboring power company gave you one line with power, how many substations would it take to energize your crank path to restart your power grid and get everything back up and running? And the answer is these black start plans take around 7 to 15 substations, and that's what we've built. We've built a power grid that we can simulate these black start plans against, and we've built multiple utilities into the scenario so that we can go through how 2 or 3 utilities would have to come together to work on restoring the power grid. Within Plum Island, I should mention thank you to the Department of Homeland Security. They have a facility off Long Island where they do research. If you can see my pointer, their research facility is only on the western corner, which means that this large facility can be used for our research too without disturbing them. And the deal we built with them is we can start building out, let's see, the video stopped playing. But what the deal we have with them is that as we build out our power grid and our power lines and build around their facility, we can start to take over the actual overhead power grid of this island. And then what we do on the back end is we overlay that into a real map of the eastern seaboard so we can look at if these actions are happening on this island, what that actually means from a strategic perspective for the restoration of our U.S. power grid. So what you'll see here are these Connex boxes. And within those Connex boxes, which we've spread miles apart around this whole island, are both power boxes that route real loads, 240, 480, and we actually go up to 13.5 kilovolts for the medium voltage lines we use to simulate the transmission lines and interconnects. And then we have the cyber boxes where we mount protective relays, RTUs, all the boxes you'd find in a real substation that are now actually responsible for these circuits. So we let a red team come in advance to simulate an adversary being 100% successful. And then we challenge our cyber teams to come in afterwards and look at how during this worst case scenario where the adversary did everything they want to, can you still start to clean these devices? Can you still start to restore the grid? So what we're proud of is that we can then start to look at the results of our experiments and look at how long it would actually take for specific scenarios. So I'm not going to say you should, run to the bank and say, oh, it takes radix 4.5 days. But what you can look at is, okay, given an adversary of this strength, given what the complexity of their attack, here's the types of tools that are useful, here's the types of attacks that reduce the number of dispatches you have to do to each substation, here's the number of attacks, here's the types of responses that let you quickly re-energize things. And what we've looked at is bringing in every part of the community we possibly can. We use National Guard units to test out the real radios they would use, that they are using during hurricane response. We look at out-of-band telemetry that let us recreate how to regain that situational awareness, even if an adversary is able to corrupt all of your telemetry data and your human-machine interface. We look at abnormal physics conditions. We look at when actions of breakers are happening, when they're open and close commands. And then we look at that active forensics piece where we're going in and restoring the actual devices. What I'll say is that this goes all the way from the strategic DOE level of planned emergency orders all the way down to the tactical level of dispatches. And what we've grouped our research in are across these 5 categories. First, situational awareness. How do you figure out what's happening? One of the major lessons we've learned from the Radix program is that physics doesn't lie. And if you have this ability to get this out-of-band situational awareness of what the power lines are actually doing, it doesn't really matter what the adversary has been able to do to your grid. You're still going to know the truth of what's actually happening.
And Walter, I'm going to jump in real quick.
Please.
The slides aren't advancing. And so I feel that people are truly missing out on getting that. And so kind of side note, we will be able to, if you don't mind, we will happily post these and share these with folks so that you can kind of get the good visualization that goes along with what Walter's been talking about. So, sorry.
Of course. Are you able to see them now?
Yes. And so it's keeping them going forward. And I'm just going to just fade it back into the background and continue on, sir.
Got it. I apologize for that. So this is the view you were missing, if you can see that video.
Yeah, we've got, I don't know if the video is going, but we definitely have the strategic and operational gas pipeline and power line exercise scenario up there.
So what we're again able to look at is across this entire physical island, how people dispatch, how people respond to these events, and what techniques are useful to detect, what techniques are useful for response and remediation. And we'll, of course, send these over, but what we're looking at from the lessons learned perspective is from a situational awareness perspective, getting that out-of-band awareness of your power grid, being able to measure the voltages, the currents, through separate sensors that aren't necessarily directly tied into the OT networks, lets you independently understand what the power grid's doing, even if it is compromised. The other thing we've learned is that power companies really need to see what cyber attack looks like on a power grid before a real attack. What we found is that every utility we bring in are skeptical at first to talk to the cyber teams because they did not necessarily understand the implications of what is compromised and what that compromised box could do to their entire system. What we found also within the program is that with data, even if we log actions, there's so much data, it isn't clear which the bad action was. And it's been a huge challenge of the situational awareness teams to be able to prioritize, this is just normal grid activity. This is what an adversary is doing to the power grid, even though it's a type of attack we may not have seen before, because you don't really see attacks on a daily basis within the OT system of a power grid. And then it's clear that we have a problem that most of our cyber tools that you see being deployed to power grids are passive in nature. And one of the things people are scared to do is to scan these OT networks because it's not guaranteed that the scan itself wouldn't cause adverse actions. So we know that there's an issue from a cyber perspective with the devices on the power grid when a blue team scan itself could cause bad things to happen. From a network isolation perspective, what we want to make sure we do as we respond is provide that remote forensics capability. We talked at the beginning, uh, you know, during these types of scenarios, we want to make sure that we aren't sending everyone to every place on the power grid. One of the things COVID has done for us in a good way is forced us to prioritize how many people actually have to travel to support a restoration, and how many experts can you VPN in to provide remote cyber forensic support. And what we're trying to prepare for are better scenarios where the fewest number of people actually have to go on site as possible, and then what that looks like from a remote restoration perspective. From a threat analysis perspective, one of the things we've learned that really concerns me is that a remote adversary that's broken into devices on the grid will often actually have lower level or greater access than a cyber forensics team. A lot of the devices you find on a power grid have little LCD screens and buttons on the front, and you're told go back to the manufacturer if there are any issues and RMA this device. And there really aren't ways from a cyber forensic standpoint that you can really understand what's going on your device at the same level the adversary can conduct their attack. So we've tried to push for additional interfaces, additional means, additional tools that can be used, and that should be something that this crowd at the ICS Hacking Village would be very familiar with. Just starting research on a device requires you to gain that lower level access to actually understand what's going on. I'll say that from a testbed perspective, again, what we really want to see is ways to run experiments. The biggest takeaway from this whole program is the ability to put real people in the same room, real power engineers in the same room as cyber responders, and ask them to try to solve problems together. What we found is that the first day or two of any response, neither side really understands each other or the vocabulary each other are using. And it really takes those 2 days of working together to even understand on either side what is important and what isn't, and what a certain attack means, and what the implications of that attack are. We think that obviously you should have these workshops, have these scenarios, have these exercises together so that you have those conversations before a real attack, and then you have a higher bandwidth response when it comes time to actually do remediation. And then from a red team perspective and an evaluation perspective, we want to see what is possible to find quickly, what isn't, what adversaries could do to our grid, and how we'd be able to remediate it. One of the surprises for me that made me really happy by the end of this program is that over the last 4 years, the red team has been complaining more and more, saying, we're not sure we're going to be able to stop the responders from catching everything in the first 3 or 4 days. And we're not sure we can even make this last a week. To me, that's great. That means that our defensive tools, our instruments, our out-of-band sensors are instrumenting the grid so well that there isn't a way to keep conducting attacks for long periods of time. And that's actually a success of the program, not a failure of the red team. But certainly we want to see that back and forth, and we want to see how to keep these researchers challenged and how to get their research into the hands of real utilities as the program shuts down. Those were the end of my prepared remarks, but I'm happy to answer any questions or add into a discussion.
Oh, excellent. Thank you. And let's see. And we had a couple of comments on the slides issue, but and again, just to reiterate for everyone, we will get those posted and added. But one of the things I've been hearing a lot lately is that purple team focus. Are y'all seeing both with this project as well as just in general that focus on we can't be siloed into red team? It's it's not as effective to be siloed into red team and blue team, and really getting those conversations and resource kind of building between the two. Have y'all seen, or what have you seen with what you've been working on, a shift, a shift towards that, or?
Yeah, what I'd say is that the most effective defensive forensic analysis tools today often look very similar to a red team's tools. Your goal is to get into the device, dump the memory, and figure out what the processes are doing, figure out what the state is, figure out if there are additional processes running. Devices on the grid really don't want you to do that to them. And blending red with blue, creating teams that can work together on this challenge is in everyone's interest. We really want to understand everything about our devices, that we have confidence in them and we can use them effectively to keep the power grid running. What I'd say is that long term, there probably need to be computer architecture changes in devices to really better protect against what a remote adversary could do. And fundamentally, you really just want it to be impossible for someone with a remote connection to get into the device and change its memory. We should look at building into these devices themselves protections that stop you from doing certain actions to them remotely, unless you're there trying to reprogram them yourself.
Well, I mean, it's always, I always get fascinated by but that system was air gapped. Surely they couldn't get in. It's like, yeah. So I think narrowing the attack surface so that it has to be, or it requires at least a closer proximity, absolutely helps strengthen, especially when you talk about some of the ICS infrastructure that are in remote areas to begin with.
I think what we find is that all air gaps have bridges, and
Exactly.
I'm not sure the word air gap actually means what people think it means.
Hey, inconceivable, inconceivable, I tell you. No, well, that's great. So what are some of the things that you're focusing on, kind of next step as 2020 winds down, and areas that are, I guess, coming across your attention that, hey, let's transition more into this, and you know, we weren't thinking of this before, let's start looking at it.
So what I'll say is that the Radix program itself is going to end this calendar year. So what we're focused on by December is making sure that what we've built that's effective is making it out to utilities as we wind down our research here. One quick example, National Rural Electric Co-op Association is actually one of the research teams on our program. So inherently everything we do with them makes it into co-ops and is protecting those co-ops. There are other teams that have commercialized their tools and are selling them. There are other teams that have written papers that will be picked up by other researchers to continue that research forward. But as a program itself, Radix is winding down and turning over our research to DOE and to other research teams to continue. From a personal architecture research perspective, we do have a new program called Guaranteed Architectures for Physical Security, where we do look at how do you build air gaps within side of computer architectures, within side of the actual circuit boards of devices, so that you can really air gap, hey, this is the thing providing protection for me, and no commands can go across that could affect that protection.
Well, that's fascinating. We'll be on the lookout for that. And are there good repositories or resources where some of these that you found, some of these papers and this research is getting published, or conferences, other than, of course, Hack the Capital, that people should be on the lookout for to find this stuff as it starts becoming disclosed or starts being disclosed?
What I'd say is that throughout the program, people have written papers. We, DARPA, are the agency that brings people together and funds it. You wouldn't see Radix at the top of that paper. It would be by a team that would credit DARPA funding. But I'd say that a lot of the research we funded has made it into all the publications this crowd would be used to, and we've been to S4, and we've been to some of the other conferences to talk about this research.
Excellent. Well, thank you. And thanks for focusing on this topic and creating those opportunities for some really excellent research to be able to get out into the public. And so, and also thank you as well for your time. And just to reaffirm for everyone, we will get links to the slides. The recording of the presentation will be available on icsvillage.com.